Good evening, and thank you for joining the New York Jewish Week and UJA Federation of New York for our monthly Folio literary series. I'm Thea Wieseltier, Director of Public Programs at 70 Faces Media, the parent company of the New York Jewish Week. It's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's conversation. We're delighted to have author Daniela Gerson with us in conversation with Molly Tulsky, our editorial director and culture and lifestyle. They'll be discussing Daniela's new book, The Wanderers, a story of exile, survival, and unexpected love in the shadows of World War II. It's a deeply personal and far-reaching story that follows two families across continents, from Poland to the Soviet Gulag, through Central Asia, and ultimately to the United States, tracing a journey shaped by resilience, love, and unexpected turns. We're also grateful to our partner, UJA Federation of New York. Their abiding work reflects so much of what this story is about, supporting Holocaust survivors and immigrant communities with care and dignity and the resources to rebuild their lives. If you'd like to learn more, you can find the link in the chat. And with that, I'm very pleased to turn things over to Daniela and Molly.
Thank
Hello. Hi, Daniela.
Hi, Mom.
Thank you, Thea. First, congratulations on this book. I can tell from reading it how much of an immense emotional and challenging, and I'm sure rewarding journey it was to write it, and to share this incredible story. So congrats and thank you for sharing it with us. Uh,
Thank you, Molly. It's so great to be here.
So I'd love to start, I think the hook that certainly drew me in, and I'm sure the hook that draws so many readers into this story is you met your wife Talia at a picnic in Los Angeles. You had some things in common, right? You're an immigration reporter. She's an immigration lawyer. You thought maybe she could be a source. And then you very quickly kind of discovered that you have this amazing connection, which is that your grandparents and her grandparents were both from the same small town in Poland, Zamość, and they both escaped Poland at the beginning of World War II via the Soviet Union, and then eventually through many, winding roads in many countries, to survive. And then you two they literally grew up, your grandparents grew up basically across the street from each other, and here you are just randomly meeting in LA, which is incredible. And I think, you write in the book, a lot of people have said like, oh, it's beshert, it's fate. And I'm curious for you now, having done this huge amount of research into the stories and into the decisions that each of your families made, does it feel like Bashert to you that you ultimately met and fell in love and married Talia, or does it feel like something else?
Mm. Well, yeah. I think like the first is sort of like, what is Bashert, right? Like, when are you? It feels completely meant to be, and that I actually got to do this book, and that we both focused on immigration, and that we connected and found each other randomly at this park in Los Angeles. And then, and that our grandparents were from the same town. Like that was one thing we discovered, which was really extraordinary. What I discovered was a little bit less extraordinary, though the journey was extraordinary, was that they survived by fleeing to the Soviet Union. Because initially that also felt part of this incredible coincidence that they went on this journey of 5,000 miles where they first fled to Ukraine, and then in Ukraine when they were deported to the Gulag, and then they were freed from the Gulag and ended up in Central Asia, and then came back to Poland, but in Western Poland, and then the DP, or displaced persons, or refugee camps. And that felt like a remarkable parallel journey, which it is. But what I discovered is it's the way the biggest group of Polish Jews survived the Holocaust. And that was not as remarkable that they shared it, but that they lived, that once our grandparents lived across the main square from each other in Zamość, that is really an amazing coincidence. And then it has felt more of a shared in some ways. because I've always been interested in this story, but only with Talia could I explore it in the way I did, and so much as a migration journey, because both of us are so focused in migration as well. And also just, I think also as two women to be able to fall in love at this moment and that we're able to live our lives together was also a feeling of that magic of coming together.
Um, you mentioned it was a surprise to you to find out that this is actually the story of so many Polish Jews who survived. And I know you write in the book that it doesn't seem like this is one of the common narratives that we see in other Holocaust media stories, documentaries. Like, so I'm curious why you think that is. Like, why is this aspect of it not talked about as much as perhaps other forms of survival?
Yeah. One thing that was interesting to me is even after writing the book, I went back to this eighth grade research paper I'd done. And this was the first time I really had written about this story. And in the eighth grade research paper, I had read from Lucy DeWitowitz's The War Against the Jews about how hundreds of thousands of Polish Jews survived in the Soviet Union. And, I had written that, more than 30 years ago. And that was based on research that was done even before that. So this isn't a revelation, but why isn't it better known? And I think it's partly, and in some ways I knew also that many, many people had survived this way. I didn't think it was most people. Like that hadn't processed to me until I started working on this. Was I just knew that, there was a good group that had survived in the Soviet Union, but I wasn't a historian and hadn't processed that. What I noticed as I was working on it is I kept going to Holocaust museums and seeing that this was barely mentioned, how people survived in the East. Or I would talk to Jewish professionals and I'd be like, how do you think the biggest group of Polish Jews survived? And nobody said to me in the Soviet Union, even though this is clearly true and it's always been true. I think one of the reasons it's not known as well is, I mean, first I looked at my own family story, and my grandfather was really focused on commemoration. And he was part of the Zamość Society in New York, which met at the Workmen's Circle. And they would take a bus to Paramus, New Jersey, where they created this monument to the martyrs. And the martyrs were their family members who were murdered by the Nazis who stayed behind in Poland, their family members who stayed behind in Poland. And so their focus on commemoration, even though my family did talk about what had happened, the commemoration focus was on those who were killed by the Nazis. And for many, there was almost this feeling of guilt also. There's a great paper that's entitled, Brother, I Too Have Suffered, about in the displaced persons camps as people who had survived in the Soviet Union talked to those who'd survived the Nazi camps and said, we also went through something. But there was sort of this battle of who had suffered the most. And those had been exterminated. And who had survived that had suffered just unmeasurably. So it's hard to tell your story when it's up against that. The other has to do with shifting positions of both the United States and Palestine and Israel toward the Soviet Union, Stalin. So initially an ally, nobody wanted to hear what Stalin had done. And then later, as an enemy, nobody wanted to admit that they had been in the Soviet Union. So it's another reason people didn't talk as much about their experiences. And then it's also a very complicated story. And even as I tell people the story, I get to the Gulag and then I get to Uzbekistan and I can see their eyes start to glaze over. People can follow from Ukraine to Uzbekistan sort of. And by the time I'm in Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, they're like, what is she talking about? And so I think that's also is the complexity. And then also a lot of records were closed under communism and many are almost impossible to get again today. And they're in so many different languages as well.
Um, you mentioned your family and your father's or grandfather's kind of commitment to commemoration. Your book also touches on Talia's family, who were much more silent about it. I think you referred to it as like a cloak of silence that kind of fell over their family, and you sort of speculate on a few different reasons why that might have been. But so I'm curious if you can talk more about that, about the differences between your families, and if it made your process, you were not just on this, research journey, travel expedition uncovering your family's stories, but her family's stories too. So if it, what was her side of things much more challenging because it wasn't talked about as much among them?
Yeah, so when Talia and I first made this connection, we were, as you mentioned, we were at this bar in this neighborhood here in Los Angeles, Silver Lake. And we're like, our families are both from Zamość. And the next question I asked her is, was your family also in Siberia or in Russia? And she was like, oh, yes, in Siberia. And then I asked, well, what about in Uzbekistan? And she's like, I don't know. They never talked about it. And to me, coming from a family where we always talked. And like I was interviewing and interviewing, starting with that eighth grade research paper, but probably even before that, and have various recordings. And then also my family had talked to the Shoah Foundation and to Jewish Federation of Greater Washington. So I had more than 10 hours of recordings in my family. And I was only able to get 1 hour of a survivor from her family, and one we later found of her father as well. And her father, like it really struck me. I loved her father. But when I first met him, and I was so excited to tell him that our families were from Zamość, and when I told my father that I'd met someone, hadn't mentioned we weren't even dating then. So I was just like, I met someone, her family's from Zamość. She's like, Zamość, you know. And I tell Talia's father, who's Israeli, and he was like, oh. And he was so enthusiastic in other ways when he met me, but about this, it was clearly not something he was that interested in. And I look in the book, I look a little bit about different modes of commemoration. One of the differences I did see that had been researched was between Israel and the United States, where many American Jews tended to hold on to the story of what happened to their families in a more of an individual way than a collective way in Israel, and less so about the individual stories of suffering. I mean, of course, these are all generalizations, but there had been research done on that. And for Talia's family, the big challenge was, I would come back with like scores of records about my family and information, or going to Uzbekistan, I knew where to go. And for Talia's family, I just couldn't find anything. But it also created these incredible revelations. Like, it was 4 years ago, I realized this summer that we were planning on going to Poland in months to go try and find our family history in Zamość. And I knew that Talia's grandfather had had a first wife and child he never spoke about. And he never told Talia's father that he had lost a wife and child to the Nazis. But Talia's father had discovered, after his own father had died, about this first family and this half brother, and we wanted to know details of them, but I couldn't find anything. And then I found a high school teacher in Zamość who helped me track them down. And suddenly this sort of nameless family became a 6-year-old boy named Kalonimus and a mother named Miriam, Manya Miriam, and we had photos and we had images, and it was shattering to actually put a face to a story that had always been anonymous. And so one element was that in doing the reporting, I discovered so much more about Talia's family than I was able to in mine. In some ways, I had discovered more nuance and other details in mine.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, when you were like first going to Poland, were you going there with the idea that you were writing this book, or did the idea for the book come after you had started actually digging in and uncovering these stories?
So I started about 5 years ago with the idea of the book. And what happened was when Talia and I met that night at the bar, that night we were like, we are going to track those stories down. We are going to figure out, we weren't even dating then. I still honestly hadn't considered that I would date a woman, let alone marry. And then life got in the way. We did date, we did get married, we had kids, and our fathers both died. And that all happened, particularly, we got married. The next year, Talia's father died. 2 years later, we had our kids. And a year later, my father died. And after my father passed away, I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times. And in it, I described how my father had come to the United States under a fake identity, and it was about refugee policy. But when I was speaking to the editor, writer Sarah Wildman, and I told her that Talia and I were from the same town, Poland, she was like, oh, now that's a book.
Hmm.
And living in LA, the next thing I did was talk to some Hollywood friends and who were not Jewish. And I was like, so, you really think there's a book in here? And they're like, oh, yes, focus on the grandfathers. And so then I started to think about how to develop this, and I started to work on a book proposal. And initially, Talia and I were going to go on our own to Zamość, and we were planning this in February of 2022. And we were going to go to Zamość, and Zamość is right on the Ukrainian border. And then we were going to go to Lviv, which is where our families fled to. And then Russia invaded Ukraine, and our plans needed to shift. And initially in the book, you wouldn't know this from reading it, but what I ended up doing was going first to Uzbekistan, where my father was born. And later that fall, we went to Poland. And by then we knew Warsaw was fairly safe and Zamość was fairly safe to go. I went to Ukraine later without the kids on my own. Um, but yeah, then we decided. And what also happened, which you wouldn't know from the book, is initially we had planned on going on a quick trip to Poland for 2 weeks and to Tel Aviv for 6 weeks. And we kept looking for places to stay in Tel Aviv and also for a preschool to enroll our then 5-year-old kids. And as we were looking and looking, there was like Tel Aviv was so expensive. And then we realized we could stay in Warsaw for much less, and that everybody wanted English-speaking kids, and there were all these English-speaking preschools. And so we flipped it. We went for 6 weeks to Warsaw, and with a side trip to Zamość, and then we went to Tel Aviv for 2 weeks. And we had an extraordinary time. Our kids were in preschool in Warsaw, and it was really like it was one of the best times of our lives, I think. We just loved it.
I wanted to ask about your kids and how they came along for the journey. I have a 4-year-old who I can't like most days can't get to like get out the door to go to school or to like go to her favorite park. It's like such a struggle. You brought twins, 4-year-old twins, or were they four or five?
They
Uh,
turned 5 while we were there. Yeah, there were
okay.
4 when we left.
Which like so first of all, I just commend you. That's I don't know how you did it. And but I just kept thinking about you're there and you're uncovering such heavy, dark, moments in your family's history and in the collective world's history. And then you're also just parenting kids who are, kids and they're silly and they're bright and they're joyful. I wrote down one of my favorite lines from the book, which was at some point you were meeting with somebody to kind of like go through papers, and your kids, I think you might have been like at a cafe or something, and your kids were kind of in the background, and it says, "Into the lull, our kids' giggles floated over to us, a welcome return to the present." Um, and I find that so beautiful and such stark contrast of just like these two different timelines that you're kind of in during this journey. And I'm just curious how having your kids there for part of this affected you on an emotional level, or just like how you think it actually shifted the way that you went about this project.
Yeah. It was a huge gift to us, I think, because I think that line that you brought up, the half brother of Talia's father, who was killed, was about the age of our kids when his father had last seen him. So you feel very much this presence of these children being killed and how dark this history is. But at the same time, our kids are having a really good time. And they're also connecting us to Poland in new ways. We enroll in this preschool. The preschool's fabulous. Our kids left their Los Angeles public school, and every Polish preschool, they seem to have a soup course, and there's an organic kitchen in it. And we get this great cargo bike, and we're going, and they suddenly have some Polish friends. And so, we had instilled in us a lot of the dark, heavy connections to Poland that our grandparents had, and that our kids were able to forge new ones. And then at the JCC in Warsaw, there was sort of this like these queer like madrichim or counselors that I think they called them, who did this Sunday activity for kids, and they were able to participate in it and learn there. And then when we went to Zamość, they also, that passage is from in Zamość when we're talking to these historians about the past, but our kids would be, we would be over in uprooted cemetery where there's a playground, and they would be playing up and down on the playground and not noticing the cemetery. But it also brings you back to there's so much joy here in this moment, so much beauty also. And that tension of living side by side, but also this question of what do you want to hold on to and pass on to the next generation? And I would also say it was just a lot of fun to be there with them,
Yeah.
even though it was the stories were depressing. Warsaw was, I mean, Warsaw in the Warsaw Park, because it comes out of a socialist history, they had just all sorts of toys the kids could take everywhere, and they can just take them at the park. So you see all sorts of elements of a society you wouldn't see and are able to engage with in different ways too.
Did they know kind of like what you were doing there? And I guess now also like they're now 8, I think you said.
Yeah.
So like how much have you shared with them of these stories?
When we were there, I don't think they processed much. Um, like we didn't tell them. Now, I mean, partly through, I feel like the I Survived series is when our kids first heard about Nazis. That, and they went to a Jewish school for the past year and a half. I don't know how much they know at this point about the Holocaust in detail, which is probably something I should ask them. I know they know something bad happened. I know they know that Jews have suffered in some way. And they also know that Kalonimus, this boy, that there was a wife and son. And I think our daughter still feels like we could maybe find Kalonimus somehow. She's seen his picture. She's heard me talk about it, and she's very inquisitive. So I feel like she felt like the next book could be finding Kalonimus. And I didn't tell her, no, he was probably, I mean, we don't like the story is he was killed at Belzutz. He may have been shot in the book. They say maybe he was shot on the platform going there, but I haven't gotten into all of those details with them yet. And it's a question for how much do you share? When do you share? I asked a friend who's Jewish but lives in Germany, whose daughter is a little older, how she dealt with that. And she was like, Poppy has always known because you can't grow up in Germany and not know. And it's all around you. And I do feel like at a certain point, because we are talking about this, our kids do know a lot. And then I'm also grateful that they're able to have encounters with Poles and Germans that doesn't make it only a state of horrific victimization, but that they can also connect in some ways.
Yeah. Just a reminder to anyone in the audience, and I see some people already have, please put any questions you have in the Q&A box, and I will be sharing some of those in a bit. The what you were just saying about kind of like how your kids are able to see also the beauty and that these places are full of wonderful people now. And I was very struck by your grandparents. Like their sort of motto was never forgive, never forget, never forgive. I think these days we hear never forget quite a bit. I don't think I've heard never forget, never forgive. And I'm wondering if you have a sense of at what point did the never forgive drop off, I guess.
An interesting study. I know, I don't know the answer to that. I know that for my grandfather, it never dropped off. And I mean, you could almost look at like, did we forgive like families by like, and this is just a case study of one of my family, but like my parents were like, we won't buy German cars. And then they did, or like, then that became not as much of a thing. And at what point do you feel like the next generation, and forgive is an interesting word, right? Like, do you forgive or do you offer some understanding? Is that forgiveness always? Because I forgive is I get, I don't know that I would necessarily forgive, but do I hold anger against every German? And I also lived in Berlin, and did a radio project on my friend whose grandfather was a like Hitler Youth. And what responsibility does she hold? My father used to come with me to Germany and be like, do these German young people wake up being worried that they were inflicted with a sickness that they can't get rid of? And so that moving on, but then, and I talk about in the book where Zelensky is using that same line against the Russians, right? We will never forgive and we will never forget what is happening. And I think there is also the element of being third generation. I mean, my father was born a refugee, so you could like during at the end of World War II, but you could say second or third. Um, but what other space do we have? And one of the other themes that comes out for me in the book is that so many people that I knew only as perpetrators, I was also able to see as victims, including the Poles of Zamość, which I never heard growing up. I didn't know that there had been a huge ethnic cleansing campaign by the Nazis against the Catholic Poles, that there had been like tens of thousands in the surrounding area of children separated from their families and turned over to Germans, that the town was going to be renamed Himmlerstadt and rid of all Poles. Like I'd never heard about Polish suffering. And so how do you take in, I only heard about Poles being, according to my grandfather, as bad as the Nazis.
Yeah.
So there's also that question of distance and can you take in multiple suffering and how does that work?
You brought up being third generation, and I was gonna ask because I feel like, and maybe this is just anecdotal from where I sit and that among, my age, which is gonna be more third generation. It feels like it's a third generation thing these days to kind of like do what you did or try to do what you did to like trace your roots. And there's even been like there's that Jesse Eisenberg movie that came out about him, his character and his cousin going.
Mhm.
Um, to Europe to trace their family's Holocaust past. And I'm wondering, yeah, if you have thoughts on why kind of that urge might come out in the third generation, perhaps more than second generation, like if it kind of skipped over your parents and fell to you to like really take this on.
One thing that was interesting for me personally listening to the Shoah Foundation recording is I forgot I had been interviewed. And I was interviewed around when I was 20, I think I was 21. And then I was very fixated on this idea that soon we will be the last generation with connection to the survivors, to having heard a Yiddish accent from somebody who was from Poland and had to flee. And what do we carry with us and how do we connect to these places? So I think for me, and I think it comes from that is this bridge. Like we grew, and particularly as American Jews also, for many of us, we grew up with a lot of privilege, and we also grew up not feeling different from our other white peers, for example. I mean, a little different, but not to try and understand what it was like to be a victim in this way, who would go after us, but what is this place that you'd always heard about? I think it's a big draw. When I was talking to agents about my book, or to editors with my agent, um, I realized that one of the things I kept saying is, oh yeah, my book doesn't start with me like in a closet digging through, trying. I had no great revelation. And then somehow the book does actually start in the end with this letter. But it does feel like such a trope of so many of these books where someone is like gone into their family archives in some way and they come up with something and they want to unravel their connection to that. I think it's also a very human experience of wanting to know where you came from and what you've inherited. And I think it's something that you mentioned Talia's family not having that same history. I think one of the elements that's been really rewarding for her is to understand more what her family members went through and also what they were hiding, like what they didn't tell her and how that shapes what she thought she knew about her past and her history.
Um, I'm gonna share a few questions from the audience, which have been coming in. Please continue to send them in. First of all, there's just a lot of people, and I'm sure you've experienced this when you've been doing events around the book. That is like my family also came from, a similar area. My family has a similar story, so I think you're clearly, like you were saying before, it's not an uncommon story. It is an extraordinary story, but there are a lot of people out there very grateful to see this. Um, Somebody asked, can you talk about what life was like in Uzbekistan for the Polish Jewish refugees?
Yeah. So, and I just took a little peek. I love seeing so many similar stories. And it always brings up this question of like, so many people are saying, oh, I'm so grateful to see the story represented. It's been so moving. And it does bring that question of like, why hasn't this been represented more, which we got at the beginning a little. Uzbekistan was, I will say, for me, the most intriguing place to go to. I'd always wanted to go because, you have these Polish Jews who have not gone, for the most part, beyond the borderlands of Poland. Many were from what's called the borderlands, the Kresy, which is the border between Ukraine and Poland. And it also what historian Timothy Snyder writes about in Bloodlands. It was a very bloody region. But it's a small, like it's fairly contained. And suddenly they're like to the 2,500 miles away in Central Asia, in these Muslim countries that are part of that are republics of the Soviet Union. And I, when I touched down in Uzbekistan, I also have to say, and this will get to the question of what it was like, but I touched down, I had planned my ticket. I'd wanted to go in lots of ways since I was 22, and I had first taken a course actually in post-Soviet states, and I always dreamt of going. I touched down 2 hours before the first memorial is unveiled to Jews who survived in Uzbekistan. And I go directly to this sort of Disneyland of World War II memorials where the Israeli ambassador is unveiling the first monument. And it talks about how Uzbeks shared their bread and how the gratitude that the state of Israel, the Jewish people, felt to the Uzbeks. It was a place that was rumored to be full of bread. It was one of the reasons so many people went was because there was this book that came out in the 1920s called City of Bread that had been translated into Yiddish, and that Tashkent might be one place during World War where there was bread. The truth was when people arrived, the city was starving. Tashkent is the capital of Uzbekistan. And Uzbekistan is, it was a Silk Route city. It's stunning with these incredible, huge madrasas and mosques that are like blue azure tiles. And there are camels and parts of desert. And it's just so different from the Polish borderlands. I cannot overemphasize. And there is a historic Jewish community of Bukharan Jews there as well, who yeah, so it was incredibly foreign. The conditions, one of the things, I mean, the conditions were very rough. And the Polish Jews were in this sort of semi-legal status where they weren't Soviet citizens. And some were in communal farms where they were often starving in the communal farms. I went into a cemetery and it was full of Polish Jewish graves. And there's a sense of like the full extent of how many people died. We know that your chance of surviving if you fled to the Soviet Union was much higher than if you stayed in Poland, like magnitudes higher. But many people also died of disease, of hunger. My family members, and we're pretty typical in this, really survived on the black market. And they were doing trade that was illegal in the Soviet Union. And I think it's not a coincidence that, two of my family members, there were 8 traveling together, 2 were arrested and 1 died in jail. And my wife's uncle was also arrested for black market activity. So that's a little bit of Uzbekistan. I can tell you more if you want.
Thank you. And I will say that question came from Susan, who says her father was also born in Zamość and
Oh, really?
eventually ended up in Uzbekistan, where he met her mother and where her brother was born. So yeah.
Wow. There were a lot of babies also born, particularly in around 1945 and after. There were some before. And one of the things I've also heard from people as I've been doing some of the talking is one woman was telling me she was born on the train back and the repatriation trains in 1946.
Wow. David asked, when you were doing research in Poland, did you see any signs of Holocaust denialism there?
I know there is active Holocaust denialism, and I've heard from reporters who've dealt with it. One woman I met actually we were there for Yom Kippur and went to services in Warsaw, and I met a reporter who's a bureau chief who was able to tell me more about what is happening than I experienced. I did not directly experience any Holocaust denialism. I personally experienced the opposite. But I also was not interacting. I wasn't there to interview Poles about their experience, their perceptions of the Holocaust. Instead, I wanted to talk to the experts, and the people I talked to were just doing incredible work on commemoration. So my experience was people knew so much more than I did who were Polish about the Holocaust and what had happened. But these are Poles who are really exceptional, who had taken it upon themselves to do this research.
Um, Ty asked, did you uncover any instances of Polish Jews who ended up staying voluntarily or not in the Soviet Union?
Yeah, I can't say the statistics, but some stayed. And again, both voluntarily, they'd met someone, they'd settled, they were tired of moving, they didn't want to go back. And some were left behind. But again, I'm going to get the estimates wrong, but I would say it's around 90% went back. And the going back, I find a really interesting chapter because there is a question of why Stalin encouraged the repatriation or allowed for the repatriation of Polish Jews. He repatriated two groups of Polish citizens, Polish Catholics and Polish Jews who had been in the Soviet Union during World War II. There were also significant numbers of Polish Ukrainians or ethnic Ukrainian Poles and Belarusian Poles who he did not allow to repatriate. And so there's a lot of theories about why he let the Jews repatriate. And the Jews who repatriated then, for the most part, went on to the displaced persons camps in the US and British occupied zones, trying to get to Palestine or the United States or elsewhere. But they really created a lot of pressure for movement toward Palestine in the state of Israel.
Um, something I was thinking about when reading, I feel like this book really uncovers like how many decisions these
Mm.
families had to make throughout so many years and very quickly, right? They had they were like up against the clock having to make these decisions to leave Zamość or not, to, eventually to go back to the Soviet Union or back to Poland where their communities were decimated, or trying to get to Israel or America. And like, I'm curious, as you were uncovering these stories, to me, I would feel like, oh my God, like if my family member made one different decision, I might not exist, right? Like, or like your life might look very different, and just kind of like what it was like for you to sort of like see how many of these little decisions ultimately led to you being here, able to tell the story at all.
Yeah, I think we like to think of stories with morals, right? Like, oh, so if you make the right decision, then you survive. And this is the lesson of the story, is this is how you know when to go. But first of all, that first decision to leave, my wife's grandfather's first wife did not go. And from our perspective, it's like, why didn't you go? Get out. The Nazis are coming. It's clear. But the Soviets did not seem better for many people, and especially if your family had more wealth, because there was reasons to be concerned about what you would face with deportation or worse. And so she stayed behind. And that was a fatal decision. Then our family members decided they wanted to go back to Nazi occupied Poland, right? Like they signed up, they were in the Soviet Union. They decided this is really terrible. And we do not want to become Soviet citizens because we don't want to be stuck here forever. And they were given the option either become citizens or go back, essentially. And they chose to go back. And that ended up being the luckiest thing that ever happened to them and the worst at that moment because they were then deported to the Gulag and considered spies for the Germans for doing it. And so, like, there's this series of decisions where I would like to say that you stick to your instincts and you make the right decision and you survive. But sometimes you stick to the instinct and you make what could have been a really dumb decision, but it means you survive. Um, and I thought about these all the time. I think there's also this feeling of like survivors were smarter, survivors were more savvy. And sometimes it was just more fortunate. I mean, I probably a lot of the time more fortunate. I did see how sticking together as a family often helped and having those connections where you have that network. And I do think also faith sometimes helped too. because, and the book is called The Wanderers because many of them called themselves Wanderers in Yiddish, as this, which is a Yiddish and actually similar to a German word for migrants, essentially. But it also, I saw in a lot of the memoirs, references to the wandering in the desert of the Israelites. And this idea that this could come to an end. And if we stick, if we have some faith, we will get to the other side. So I did see feeling a tradition of faith did help power, having connections, but especially at times like today that often feel precarious, this question of like, will I know what's the right decision? How do you know when to go?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was going to ask, you wrote this research and the book was written before October 7th. Um, Obviously, it's coming out now in a world that is very different than you could have even known not so long ago when you were writing it. And the book does really dive into this question of the Jewish state and how people at the time were considering it, thinking about it. Some people were very on board, some people were not. There was a lot of debates. Obviously, we have a Jewish state now, and the debates have not gone away, certainly. And I'm curious just what it's been like for you to put this book out in the world now.
Yeah. I mean, after October 7th, one element for me that I found, I don't want to say the word is healing, but felt important was to try and understand how we got to where we are today, to interrogate, like nobody wants this bloodshed in any way, no matter where you stood on the debates of Zionism in the 1930s, where you stand almost a century later, where we are today. And so for me to be able to go back to the 1930s and see this really vibrant civic life. I mean, everyone was involved in a movement, and they were radical movements. And they felt like they could change the trajectory of their people, of their community for the better. And people really worked at it. And there was, in our family alone, there was Beitar, the Jabotinsky, far right, sort of militant approach to Zionism. There were probably some Bundist anti-Zionists. I'm not sure. For my family, my father's side was very much labor Zionists, Hamonim, and you saw these different movements. And then my grandfather was also like communist aligned, but then he decided to become a Zionist, so he wasn't communist. Like where they thought it would go. And then for me to also really get a better understanding of the role the Jews who survived in the Soviet Union, the Polish Jews, played also in the establishment of the State of Israel, and looking at when the United Nations Commission, what it saw when it visited the displaced persons camps, and the role of these Jewish refugees that played in it, but also how the Bricha, which moved people out of Poland, those who had been repatriated toward Israel, how they organized, how they got together, and then trying to delve deeply also into the displacement that followed, where my wife's family landed in Herzliya, of Palestinian displacement. And so this was in many ways the hardest to negotiate. And I thought it was one of the most important parts of the book, to really get at the complexity of Zionism, how it came to be, of the different reasons people aligned with it, and how it created Israel. And in terms of the book coming out now, I think there needs to be more discussions about Zionism. This is probably like my 16th conversation, and few of them ask me questions about the Zionism in the book. And I think it's hard to talk about, and it's hard to talk about in mixed community, like with people with very intense feelings in different ways. But I appreciate the first person to ask me about it was someone who runs a immigration news site, Documented, which is wonderful in New York, who's Somali. I think he's Muslim. I'm not certain. And another colleague from the immigration space who is a very, very adamant Palestinian activist, but wanting to understand better. And I really felt, I was like, I'm very glad you asked me about this. And one person who has written a book that's coming out soon on anti-Zionism had written me that he didn't think I could write this book right now because we can't have books that go from the Holocaust to Israel. And I said, like, I definitely disagree. I think it's so important that we discuss where we are, how we got here, and to try and understand on all different perspectives. So, yeah, I'm glad you asked. I wish more people would.
I think also, I think the way that your book does it is such a brilliant way because it attaches these real people and these real lives and the decisions that they had to make. And I think sometimes just the topic of Zionism as a whole, like it's easy to get kind of overwhelmed or just like lost, and you're not seeing the actual people who are on the ground having to make these decisions. So I think more of these stories too could be really beneficial.
Yeah, I kept coming back to my grandfather, who by the time he was 12 had fled twice, right? They'd fled to Kiev after World War One, and then there were incredibly horrific pogroms in Ukraine, and they fled back to Zamość. And his family didn't have enough money for him to go beyond Cheder, which is like the religious education. He dropped out in sixth grade, but he became this big organizer, and he became a big labor Zionist organizer. And I'm like, how does this person who has very limited education decide that he's also going to move away from Poland to the Middle East at this moment? And I think it's easy to, critique in some ways, but trying to put myself in his shoes and that passion as well for Jewish self-determination at that moment, and also a more equal society was, and I can't tell you also how many journalists who I've talked to who are like national journalists who are like, oh, they were Jewish socialists. And I'm like, of course, like the understanding of how Zionism came to be is very limited. And the flip side is also about Jabotinsky. When I talk to many Jews and about the Iron Wall and this idea, very little understanding also about some of the early debates about displacement of indigenous people. So I feel like there's a lot of education discussion, both from personal, but also the bigger debates.
I want to share this question from Ruth, who says, as a Jewish woman married to another Jewish woman in the US, do you consider leaving the US and taking advantage of Polish citizenship through your grandfather? And she shares that she's a second generation lesbian with two survivor parents, and she's working on her Polish citizenship.
I actually, through my maternal side, I have German citizenship thanks to my brother having done that. And it is very striking how many, I mean, I've always found this story of how many European Jews are taking on citizenship of the countries that their families were forced to leave right now. My wife looked into Polish as well, and it was more complicated because her grandfather moved to Israel. There's something to do with the army, and then it didn't move forward after that.
But they have such good playgrounds, I hear. I feel like you should.
Playgrounds are insane. You should go. And
I'm sold, yeah.
but just go like, September, October. I think that's the other thing. Everyone goes to Poland in like February, and it's so depressing. Or they do March of the Living, and you go to concentration camps at like the worst time of the year. And then you go to Israel, and it's beautiful. But if you went like instead, just the playgrounds in August, September, a totally different understanding.
Um, you talked a bit about this in terms of people you've been doing interviews with, but I'm curious as far as your audience for this book, how much you thought about whether this book was for a Jewish audience versus a non-Jewish audience, and also what kind of feedback you've been getting from those two audiences, and if it's been different.
Yeah. So I really wanted this to be able to connect with all different types of people. I think it is I want the Jewish audience to read it. I love having the Jewish audience read it. But I also think it's an important story. I think it's a migration story. I think it's a Holocaust story, but I actually pushed back. Initially, they wanted to have the Holocaust in the subhead of the book. And I was like, this is one, it's about the Soviet Union, and I think it should be a general World War II. But I also wanted a book that's not, people often describe sort of the exceptionality of the Holocaust. It is a book about the Holocaust, but it's also a book about migration that I hope all types of people can connect to. And so that was very important to me. I think it has been more challenging. Well, okay, let me back up. I would say I've heard from, I did this panel with this wonderful Iranian writer. She has loved the book. A bunch of the Latino activists I've worked with, I've gotten a lot of fabulous feedback from them on the book. So I've heard from a broad range of people who've liked it. In terms of getting press around it in a broader way that's about this being more of a universal book and not specifically a Jewish book, I found it a hard time to do that. And I don't know if that's, coming out at this period in history, or if there's just a lot of books. Like it's hard, you can never know for sure why that's not. Now, from the Jewish side, what's been amazing has been all these people. First of all, more people from Zamość than I ever knew existed, that I keep hearing from, and then others who never saw their story represented, and that I've really appreciated.
Somebody asked if you see any parallels with today's migration and immigration stories. And I feel like, I mean, you're the best person to ask for that, as that is also your area of expertise.
Yes, I definitely do. One is, my father, if you get at the end of the book, I write about how my father came to the United States under a fake identity. And the US really did not want these Jews who survived in the Soviet Union. I said, I talked about how they'd been accused by Stalin of spying for Hitler. Then US Congress people accused them of spying for Stalin and wouldn't let them into the United States. When the Displaced Persons Act was passed after World War II, that let in many, initially the US didn't want to let in any Jews who were most Jews who had survived. Like there was no willingness to let in most of the Jewish survivors. Then Truman opened it up, but there was pushback on those who'd survived in the Soviet Union. And as a result, many people, including my family, lied in one way or another. My family, it turned out, has many stories. It's a very complicated story, but they actually lied to get into the DP camp and then held on to that lie. But as I was starting to research, almost all the people I talked to had lied in one way or another. And they had forged the date they entered so that it wouldn't show that they'd been in the Soviet Union. They had lied to say that they would qualify for a refugee visa that included younger people. And as we're looking today, particularly at this time where our country has closed its borders to refugees with the exception of white Afrikaners, where it is so hard for asylum seekers to get in, and that President Trump keeps calling everybody criminals. Well, a lot of refugees are forced to lie at one point or another. And does that make them horrible people, or does it make them people who care about their family members and want to get them to a safer place? And I completely understand wanting to have laws in this country that work and to try and understand our asylum system. One of the challenges has been that it's broadened. And the asylum system was created out of World War II. It was created so that there wouldn't be what happened again, where people were turned away. But then how do you decide who you let in? And how do you decide when a lot of people are forced to lie? These are all very challenging questions. All I'll say is that you need empathy for the people who come here. And I was so moved this week. I've heard from one of my students I teach, and I teach at a university which has a lot of immigrant students, and one is undocumented, and she's had deferred action for childhood arrivals, which is a protective service, protected status that has now lapsed. But she told me, in our class, we talked about her status, and she was like, I had felt so ashamed always growing up. She came here as a child. Her parents took her. She's a Mexican immigrant. And I just felt so ashamed of my status. And this idea that there's this shame for people who came here, particularly these kids, because I very much resonate with them, because my father had a fake identity for a decade. And what do you do about these kids who are brought here? I mean, for everyone, but particularly the kids. So I digress. I can go on about this for a long time, but
A lot of parallels for sure. We're about to wrap up. I think a lot of the other questions that I'm seeing in the chat are kind of like testament to how many families have similar stories, but also varying levels of secrecy or silence about them. And a lot of people have like specific questions about their families. So I wonder if we can end on just any tips or advice you have for anyone to
Yeah.
go on this kind of journey, whether or not they can actually go to these places, if there are things that they can start with at home to start uncovering their family stories.
Yeah, and actually, I did write a piece about this that maybe we can mail out or put in the link, which is it was for Jewish Book Council. Sorry, put in the chat, the link in the chat for the Jewish Book Council on basically how to investigate your family history like an investigative reporter. Because I am not an expert genealogist at all, but I came at this with a background as a journalist and a journalist specializing in migration. And I'd say like the first thing I did do was I did connect with some of the Facebook groups, and all these towns have Facebook groups. And that was incredibly helpful. The memorial books, the Yizkor books, are just these full of stories of towns, and they're now translated. They're almost all available at New York Public Library, and digitally. One of the challenges I found as I did the research was as I started to get working on it, I found that the Holocaust digital records are fairly easy to find. It is harder for those who are from Eastern Poland because despite these reputation of Nazis having meticulous records, they really at Belzec, which was the deadliest camp, one of the reasons you don't hear about it as much as Auschwitz is because almost nobody survived. And record keeping, they didn't care about record keeping, they just wanted to kill people. So there's very few records from Belzec. And also the ghetto records, well, the ghetto records are okay, but not as much as I think some other towns. But the other place, the Soviet records, about a third of, if your family was deported to the Soviet Union, about a third of people deported are in a digital Gulag archive that Memorial created. You can find it. Again, all these links are here. So, but you'll see in the book that I went on like a real intense search to try and find my family, which ended up, I had to get in touch with someone in Moscow and then in Yekaterinburg, and then an interpreter slash paid hundreds of dollars to someone in Tarzana to mail via someone's suitcase because we have no mail connection to Russia. And he brought it all the way to Moscow, and then it was mailed to Yekaterinburg. And then they told me I didn't have the right papers. And then, so, I don't know that everyone will go to the lengths I did, but I put in that document some tips. And you can also visit my website at danielagerson.com, and I have a contact up there as well.
Thank you so much, Daniela. This was so wonderful to talk with you, and thank you so much to everybody who joined us. Also, there's one more question I was going to answer. Somebody asked if there's an audiobook, and there is because I listened to it, and Daniela reads it herself, and it's really wonderful. I'm an audiobook enthusiast. I would definitely recommend listening to it or
Yeah.
buying it, reading it, however you like. Thank you so much.
Tried the Yiddish accents, and at times I hit them.
You're good.
My brother's much better, and he's in the beginning. And yeah, Molly, I want to thank you. You were an incredible, like you were really good at interviewing. So I really appreciate that. And
Amazing. And thank you.
really to be here.
Thank you to my colleagues at 70 Faces and also to our partners at the UJA Federation of New York. And good night.
Bye. Thank you all.